welcome everybody, and thank you for coming along to this talk on a bank holiday. Um, Although, of course, the bank holiday um, is for May Day, even though May Day is traditionally May the 1st. When it was made a bank holiday, they moved it to the first Monday in May. Um, but people do seem to forget by now, some people do, a lot of us don't, that it is International Workers' Day, or at least May the 1st was. Anyway, welcome to all of you, and I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then, if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to take them as in previous weeks. Um, as we saw, those of you who were here, as we saw last time, by the 1970s, the post-war consensus, such as it was a consensus, was falling apart as new sensibilities were beginning to emerge. So what had previously been considered to be common sense was being derided by the 1970s as nonsense. Now, to understand to understand what was going on more generally, I think it's useful to turn to Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist theorist and politician, and he developed the concept of hegemony or hegemony to explain how the ruling capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, maintains power not solely through coercion or force, but through the active consent of subordinate groups. And this consent is achieved by the bourgeoisie establishing a hegemonic culture that promotes its values and norms as common sense, making them appear natural and universally beneficial, even though, of course, they primarily serve the interests of the elite minority. Gramsci introduced these ideas in his prison notebooks, which you can see here, which were written while he was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime from 1926 to 1937. And it was a response to the failure of socialist revolutions in advanced capitalist nations, despite the predicted inevitability of such uprisings according to classical Marxist theory. So Gramsci's theory of hegemony represents a significant departure from traditional Marxist economic determinism, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Whilst the working class were fighting the economic struggle primarily through trade union organisation, as we saw last time, which traditional Marxists argued was the base structure of society, the economy, and that culture was generally seen by Marxists as a superstructural consequence of economic struggle. Gramsci, however, emphasized the relatively autonomous role of ideology, of culture, and consent in being able to sustain power structures. He argued that the bourgeoisie secures the dominance or its dominance through ideological leadership in civil society, comprising institutions such as schools, the mass media, religion, and cultural organisations, where it shapes public consciousness and legitimises its rule. Now, this process, argued Gramsci, is not static, but requires constant negotiation and reinforcement because subordinate groups can challenge or resist the dominant ideology. So, to maintain hegemony, the ruling class relies on a balance between coercion exerted through the state apparatus like the police and the military, and consent achieved through civil society. Gramsci also introduced the concept of the war of position, which is a long term struggle to undermine the cultural and ideological foundations of the ruling class's hegemony, as opposed to what he called the war of manoeuvre, which involves direct confrontation with the state, which had been the tactic of the left throughout the 70s. So, a key concept or a key component of Gramsci's theory is the role of intellectuals in either maintaining or in challenging hegemony. And he distinguished between traditional intellectuals who often serve to reinforce the existing order and organic intellectuals, those who emerge from the working class and help to develop a counter hegemonic culture by organising and educating the masses. These organic intellectuals, he argued, are crucial in building a new historic bloc. By a historic bloc, he meant a coalition of social forces that can challenge bourgeois dominance and lay the groundwork for revolutionary change. So, a summary. Hegemony refers to the common sense of a particular era, and I put common sense in inverted commas because it's not the same as good sense necessarily. It's what is common. The moral authority of certain ideas, beliefs, and practices. And culture is relatively autonomous of the economic base. So describing beliefs as hegemonic means that those who subscribe to them take them so much for granted that it requires a deliberate and sustained effort to point out their existence as mere ideologies, let alone to change believers' minds. So hegemony is always a highly contested terrain of struggle between classes over their interests. So social change is caused by ideological and cultural struggle as much as it is by change in economic forces. And he emphasizes agency rather than structures like other Marxists do. The agency of ordinary people. So cultural contestation, contesting the culture, the prevailing culture, means that the prevailing hegemony is never totally legitimated. Some elements of the challenges to the prevailing hegemony are resisted, in other words. And Gramsci suggests that to preserve capitalism, there has to be some accommodation by the capitalist class, which he called incorporation, as there was with the post-war consensus, to win consent and secure a settlement that largely benefits the ruling class. So society, in inverted commas for Gramsci, is a moving equilibrium of historic power blocks. So in this context, it is this shift in ideology or culture in the 1970s that was the main driver of Thatcherism. Remember that from last week that the common sense or hegemony of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s to some extent was that as a society, we're all in this together, and that the welfare state was a necessary safety net for everyone from the cradle to the grave, or as some commentators put it at the time, from womb to tomb. This kind of social responsibility to each other was ingrained in our consciousness, certainly was in mine growing up in the 1950s. Support for these kind of ideas was almost universal. It was, I suppose you could say, the zeitgeist or spirit of the age. So, in this context, I hope I've explained Gransky pretty well, although his prison notebooks are fairly extensive. Um, in this context, in 1978, before Thatcher came to power, Stuart Hall, Martin Jakes, and their colleagues at Birmingham University used Gramscian theory to produce this prescient book that detected the beginnings of a massive hegemonic shift in Britain to what previously had been regarded as the extreme right, but which was in the process of becoming the common sense of the late 20th, early 21st century. The politics of Thatcherism emphasized the free market and the individual. It denigrated all welfare as the nanny state. It exhorted people to stand on their own 2 feet and take personal responsibility. And it encouraged selfishness and greed as somehow natural and the best way to grow the economy. Now, in this period, some of you may remember the Harry Enfield character, Loads of Money, a character who flaunts his wealth. He's a caricature. He was a caricature of the free market spivs that were the epitome of Thatcherite hegemony. Or you may remember Gordon Gekko with the slogan "Greed is good" in the 1987 film Wall Street. These epitomised what Thatcherism is about. But I want to say a few things about what Thatcherism was. Um, Thatcherism isn't just about Thatcher. It was a whole political ideology. It's simply called Thatcherism because she was the most visible manifestation of this hegemony of such ideas in Britain. At its core, Thatcherism promoted a free market economy, limited government intervention, and individual responsibility. It's often described as a form of neoliberalism, closely aligned with Reaganomics in the United States. The ideology emphasized monetarism, controlling inflation through tight control of the money supply, low taxation, and the reduction of public spending. So Thatcherism represented a systematic rejection of the post-war consensus. She replaced the Tory leader Ted Heath, who she considered to be wet. So the Tories came to power under her 4 years after she came to power in 1975. She came to power 4 years later in 1979, and she served as Prime Minister until 1990. It all emerged as a response to the stagnation and industrial unrest that I talked about last week in the 1970s. A consent sorry, yeah, in particular, it was a response to the so-called Winter of Discontent of 1978-79, which saw widespread strikes by low-paid workers and a loss of faith in state-managed capitalism. Prior to that, there had been a consensus which had seen broad agreement between the two major political parties on Keynesian economics, the welfare state, nationalised industries, and close regulation of the economy. Thatcher's government implemented significant tax cuts, reducing the basic rate of income tax to 25% and slashing the higher rate from 83% to 40%, while shifting towards indirect taxation like VAT. So, a central pillar of Thatcherism was also the privatisation of state owned industries. This included British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, and the electricity companies, which were transferred to private ownership. This was part of a broader effort to, in her words, roll back the frontiers of the state and reduce the role of government in economic life. It became the common sense of the age that state ownership meant inefficiency and bureaucracy, whilst private ownership meant modernisation, dynamism, and a better and cheaper service. Of course, it was an ideology rather than a reality, as we've all experienced. Privatisation included selling off council houses. Now, whilst this significantly increased home ownership, it also severely diminished the stock of council homes to rent, as local authorities were not allowed to spend the money they got from the sales of council houses on building more council houses. As one work colleague said to me at the time, when people buy their council houses, the first thing they do is put a hardwood front door on it and a carriage light outside. And the second thing they do is switch from voting Labour to voting Tory, because they now erroneously consider themselves to be part of the property owning classes. And there was some truth in that. Thatcherism is also defined by its social conservatism. Thatcher promoted, and Thatcher's governments promoted traditional family values. This was despite the fact that, for example, her senior cabinet minister, Cecil Parkinson, who promoted her traditional family values mantra, was revealed to be having an affair with his secretary, Sarah Keyes, who later bore his child. He was forced to resign, but as usual, was elevated to the Lords. Also, this social conservatism included deriding and attacking gay relationships. Some of you may know about the controversial Section 28 of the Local Government Act in 1988, which effectively prohibited local authorities from promoting the discussion of homosexuality in schools. This exemplified this social stance. Thatcher also described gay families as pretend families. She promoted self-help and personal responsibility. These were described as Victorian values. This included a strong emphasis on individualism and a suspicion of collective action, particularly from trade unions and the civil service. Thatcherism also championed British nationalism and a strong foreign policy, notably through the successful military campaign in the Falklands War in 1982, which I'll look at later, and close cooperation with the imperialism of the US President Ronald Reagan. This last feature of Thatcherism was a key part of what Andrew Gamble, in his chapter in the Hall and Jakes book, called authoritarian populism. That was a term that Andrew Gamble coined, but which has been used extensively since. So let's have a look at that. So, as I say, the term was invented by Andrew Gamble in his chapter in The Politics of Thatcherism. Gamble's analysis situated authoritarian populism within broader political and economic transformations, including the rise of neoliberalism and the crisis of the post-war consensus. Gamble examined how authoritarian populism intersects with economic policy, particularly in the context of Thatcherism, which he viewed as a pivotal moment in reshaping the Conservative Party's approach to governance and the economy. He also argued that the resilience of neoliberalism stems from its ideological malleability, the gap between its rhetoric and reality, and its ability to achieve discourse hegemony by becoming embedded in what is perceived to be common sense. This ideological dominance has helped sustain neoliberal policies even after major crises such as the 2008 financial crash. So, a central feature of authoritarian populism is the construction of an us versus them narrative, where the people are portrayed as a homogenous, virtuous group under threat from an external other. Sound familiar? Um, so it's a hybrid form of governance that operates within democratic states, which undermine democratic norms. And this external other is often defined by race, culture, religion, or nationality, and an internal elite accused of betraying the people's interests. This dual lens fosters a sense of belonging rooted in othering, enabling leaders to justify anti-pluralist, nativist, and authoritarian measures as necessary for national security and stability. And this rhetoric often targets immigrants, minorities, and established institutions like the judiciary, the traditional mass media, not the mass media of today, academia. Thatcher had a go at universities, labelling them as corrupt or illegitimate. I mean, this all sounds familiar to us now, but it wasn't then. And it thrives in times of crisis, such as economic downturns, migration surges, or global pandemics. It thrives by offering simplistic solutions to complex problems and by exploiting public frustration with institutional failures. So, despite its lack of a coherent policy platform, it functions as a fully fledged political ideology by uniting diverse grievances around a shared narrative of national renewal and protection from perceived threats. We want our country back, kind of thing. There were early signs of this coming. An early sign of this coming extreme nationalism and racism, came in the West Midlands constituency of Smethwick in the 1964 general election. In this constituency, which had a high number of Commonwealth immigrants, particularly Sikhs, the shadow cabinet member, Patrick Gordon Walker, was expected to win convincingly, but he lost to the Tory Peter Griffiths. You can see from the poster the kind of campaign that Griffiths ran. But Griffiths went even further by repeatedly using the slogan, and if you'll excuse my language, I'm just quoting what he said: if you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour. When challenged about this, Griffiths refused to disown the slogan, stating that he would not condemn any man who said it and that it is a manifestation of popular feeling. His stance shook the nation and drew condemnation from the then Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who famously referred to Griffiths as a parliamentary leper. Nevertheless, Griffiths also blamed immigration from the Caribbean for the spread of disease in Britain. The legacy of Griffiths' campaign is widely regarded as one of the most overtly racist in British political history. It highlighted deep-seated racism in parts of the UK, but at the same time, it contributed to the passage of the first Race Relations Act in 1965. Now, Griffiths lost his seat in the 1966 general election to Labour, but he did return to Parliament later and remained a Tory MP until the 1997 general election. Another early sign of this extreme nationalism and racism came in 1968 when Tory shadow cabinet minister Enoch Powell made his now infamous Rivers of Blood speech at a meeting in Birmingham. He criticised the UK's immigration policy, particularly the influx of Commonwealth immigrants after World War II, and opposed the proposed Race Relations Bill, which aimed to outlaw racial discrimination. He warned that unchecked immigration would lead to social upheaval, stating, like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood, which was a reference to Virgil, symbolising impending civil conflict. He called for the repatriation of immigrants. Edward Heath, who Thatcher described as a wet, then Conservative leader, dismissed him from the shadow cabinet the next day. However, polls suggested that 67%, and in another poll, 82% of Britons agreed with aspects of Powell's message, and thousands protested his sacking, including some London dockers who went on strike and marched to Parliament. They weren't supported by many other dockers, and they certainly were not supported by their local and national trade union leaders. But Powell's speech fueled the growth of the National Front, a far-right neo-Nazi white supremacist political party. Their influence peaked in 1972 with 17,500 members. They campaigned for a halt to non-white immigration, the repatriation of settled immigrants, and they showed support for apartheid South Africa. Of course, it wasn't that they weren't opposed. These forces weren't opposed. They faced fierce opposition from anti fascist movements such as the Anti Nazi League and Rock Against Racism, who held huge concerts in Hyde Park. I went to the one with Elvis Costello. There was 80,000 people at that concert. The National Front deliberately intimidated communities with a large black presence by deliberately marching through those areas. This culminated in the left uniting in successfully preventing them from marching through multicultural Lewisham after violent clashes with the police who were trying to protect the fascists. Many of us took the day off work to go and support the community and defeat the fascists. In fact, it became known and went down in left-wing folklore as the Battle of Lewisham. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the National Front's influence began to decline due to a number of factors, due to internal strife, growing public awareness of racism, and a shift in mainstream politics, particularly under Margaret Thatcher, whose tough immigration policies, and I put tough in inverted commas, addressed many of the National Front's concerns without overtly endorsing its extremism. However, in a television interview with Grenada's World in Action programme in January 1978, before she came to power, after she had been appointed as opposition leader, Thatcher said this. This remark was widely interpreted as tapping into public anxieties about immigration, particularly from former British colonies, and was seen as legitimising racist sentiments in mainstream politics. It was the use of the word swamped, which was a metaphor implying inundation and threat, which helped shift the political discourse on immigration towards xenophobia, enabling the Conservative Party to appeal to voters who might otherwise have supported far-right groups like the National Front. The remarks are credited with helping the Conservatives gain a significant lead in opinion polls and contributing to their victory in the 1979 general election. The phrase became a defining moment in her political career and a lasting symbol of the racialised rhetoric surrounding immigration in British politics. Later, as Prime Minister, her government supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, calling Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, who were fighting against the oppression of black people in South Africa, as just a bunch of terrorists. She also encouraged trade with South Africa and sold arms to them to suppress the black majority. At the Conservative Party conference, with Thatcher's blessing, the Federation of Young Conservatives, many of whom are Conservative MPs today, had this poster and were selling T-shirts and badges with the slogan "Hang Nelson Mandela" on them. When she was Prime Minister, she also invited the fascist dictator of Chile, General Augusto Pinochet, to 10 Downing Street. Pinochet had been responsible for organising a bloody coup against the democratically elected socialist government of President Allende, of rounding up, torturing and killing thousands of Allende supporters. He'd actually held 20,000 of them in Chile's national football stadium. Thatcher resisted attempts to have him arrested while in Britain on an international arrest warrant, which was out for him, and she described him as my best friend. So it's in this context that we can perhaps better understand the politics of the next 50 years. The legacy of Thatcherite hegemony is deep rooted and long lasting. So let's look in more detail um, at the Thatcher years. Following the winter of discontent, James Callaghan called an election and lost to the Conservatives led by Thatcher. However, it wasn't just the winter of discontent or the extreme nationalism and racism that helped her win power. A very slick advertising campaign included this infamous poster that appeared on billboards, all over the country. It was designed by the advertising agency Saatchi and Saatchi to highlight the growing level of unemployment under Labour. It was 1.6 million at the time of the election. It was actually produced using trick photography. A small group of young Conservatives and their parents, fewer than 20 volunteers showed up, were photographed multiple times along a rope line and spliced together to create the illusion of a long queue outside the dole office. Now, of course, this can be easily done today with AI and so on, but at that time with the technology, that was the way they did it. Dennis Healey, Labour's Chancellor, accused the Conservatives of dishonesty, but the backlash inadvertently boosted the poster's visibility, generating an estimated £5 million in free publicity. However, because of an ideology of laissez-faire capitalism and letting the free market dictate, Keynesian demand management policies were now totally abandoned in favour of monetarist policies, believing that unemployment would fall as wages fell because more workers would be chasing the same jobs and would undercut each other. This free market philosophy also relied on no interference with the market from trade unions. So at the same time, Thatcher's government launched a concerted attack on the trade union movement. However, what monetarist policies meant in practice was that workers had less money in their pockets to spend on goods and services that were produced by other workers, and this led to soaring unemployment. By 1982, it had reached over 3 million, as you can see from this chart. So free market capitalism doesn't work, and it's never worked. Thatcher's government became the most unpopular government since polling records began. But Thatcher had a trick up her sleeve. In 1982, Argentina, under the fascist dictatorship of President Galtieri, invaded the British-owned Falkland Islands and claimed them back as their own. Thatcher sent a task force of 127 ships, including 2 aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, amphibious assault ships, and requisitioned merchant vessels, including the QE2 and the SS Canberra, to transport 30,000 troops to recapture the islands. Thousands of people lined the docks at Portsmouth to see them off, waving their Union Jacks and cheering them on. The British public, including many trade unionists and even some socialists, it has to be said, were fully supportive of Thatcher as nationalist fever resurfaced. The troops set up an exclusion zone around the islands and fought a 10-week war before recapturing the islands from Argentina. I could go into all of the lies that were told about it in detail, but I won't because I haven't got the time. But just to say that during the conflict, Thatcher totally dismissed a UN peace plan, um, even though the Argentinians would have been prepared to accept it. Instead, a British submarine torpedoed and sunk the Argentine warship, the General Belgrano, killing 323 Argentine sailors. At the time, as you can see from this map, where if you look near the bottom, it's got where the General Belgrano was. At the time, the General Belgrano was outside the exclusion zone and sailing away from the Falklands. So it was clearly a war crime. Yet, when asked whether or not it was a war crime, Thatcher said, rejoice. And the Sun headline was Gotcha, warmongering at its finest. And remember, of course, that millions of working class people read The Sun at the time. So this gung ho nationalism turned the tide. Thatcher called a general election just afterwards in 1983 and won a second term with an increased majority. So through throughout her tenure, Thatcher's government made a systematic effort to dismantle the influence of the British trade union movement, beginning with her election in 1979. The rhetoric was that trade union membership conflicted with national loyalty. Her government introduced a series of laws designed to restrict trade union activities, weaken solidarity, and make industrial action more difficult and legally risky. The Employment Act of 1980 replaced in-person workplace ballots for strike action. You know, we just used to go in the canteen, have a show of hands if we wanted to go on strike. That was replaced with unions had to have postal ballots, which increased costs and delays and it also introduced a de facto cooling off period that allowed employers time to undermine union action. The Employment Act of 1982 restricted secondary or sympathy strike action, preventing unions from supporting workers in other industries, thereby breaking solidarity. Remember the kind of solidarity that I said that engineering workers said last week that engineering workers showed in Birmingham at Saltley Gates. The Trade Union Act of 1984 mandated secret ballots for strike action, which critics argued gave employers and the mainstream media time to interfere. This law was tested during the 1984-85 miners' strike, which we'll come to in a moment, when the National Union of Mine Workers leader Arthur Scargill refused to hold a ballot under the new rules. The Employment Act 1988 was designed to protect scabs who refused to strike, reinforcing the false narrative that union leaders were coercing members. Quite the opposite. It's my experience and many other people's experience. It was more often the case that union leaders tried to persuade workers not to go on strike. The rank and file of trade unions have always been more militant than union leaders. But the Employment Act of 1990 also allowed employers to dismiss workers involved in unofficial strike action, and any subsequent strike over that dismissal was also deemed unlawful. In other words, if a union leadership hadn't called the strike, it had been called by workers themselves, it was unofficial, and therefore workers involved in it could be sacked. This Act, the Employment Act 1990, also made the closed shop illegal, making it illegal for employers to agree to hire only union members or require people that they hire to become or to remain union members to keep their jobs. This was consolidated in John Major's Tory government. And lastly, the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act of 1992 ultimately outlawed the closed shop entirely. The Tories considered the closed shop to be a restrictive practice. But trade unionists, like myself and many others, didn't see it as a restrictive practice. We saw it as a protective practice. Why should anyone in a workplace where the union negotiates wages and conditions for workers be allowed to be freeloaders? Also, under this legislation, trade unions had to ballot members every 10 years to maintain a political fund. The ballot is a renewal of the political resolution that allows the union to spend funds on political activities, such as supporting political parties or campaigning on public issues. So, for example, if a government proposed um, shutting universities and me as a union member objected to that and went on strike about it, that would be illegal because it would be a political act. So, what under the legislation, trade unions had to ballot members every 10 years to maintain a political fund. Whereas previously, individuals who didn't want to pay their trade union's political levy, the part of their subs that go to political campaigning, they had to contract out of that. Now they had to contract in. In other words, they don't pay it unless they tell their union that they want to. Now, none of these new laws, it's interesting that none of these new laws apply to employers or employer associations, many of whom contribute to Tory party funds. The cumulative effect of these laws, combined with the decline of traditional industries, reduced trade union membership from 13 million in 1979 to under 6 million by 2012. These restrictions remain in place today, with subsequent Conservative governments, including the 2016 Trade Union Act, further tightening strike rules, such as requiring 50% of members to vote in favour of strike action. You know, not 50% of those who vote, 50% of members. So if you applied that to Parliament, you'd say no MP would ever be elected because nobody ever gets 50% of their electorate. But there you are. Anyway, and it also raised penalties to £1 million for an unlawful strike. So the legacy of Thatcher's legislation continues to shape British industrial relations, making strike action one of the most legally constrained in Europe. The consequences of all this legislation, particularly the outlawing of the closed shop, as can be seen from this graph, is, as I said, that trade union membership has declined significantly. Still much higher, by the way, today than in the 1930s. In the public sector, just under half of all workers are trade union members, 48%. However, in the private sector, it's now only about 12% of workers, and many of these are in industries that used to be in the public sector but have since been privatised. And it's worse than that because in the 1970s there was sectoral bargaining in all the major sectors of the economy. By sectoral bargaining, it meant that trade unions negotiated with consortiums of employers in a whole sector, in whole sectors of the economy. Whether those people were members of trade unions, whether the trade unions were recognised in individual workplaces or not. And that meant that 80% of workers in the 1970s in Britain had their wages and conditions of employment negotiated for them by a trade union, whether or not they were a trade union member themselves. Today, it's just 20%. Because despite having a Labour government under Blair and then Brown for 13 years, none of this draconian anti-union legislation, the most draconian in the whole of Europe, none of it has been scrapped. In fact, as I say, when Sunak was Prime Minister, even more draconian anti-trade union legislation was enacted. But Thatcher wasn't finished. During her years of opposition, together with right-wing MP Nicholas Ridley, they had devised what was called the Ridley Plan for when they came to government. So, what was the Ridley Plan? Well, the Ridley Plan was a secret internal Conservative Party document drafted in 1977. It outlined a strategic blueprint for how a future Conservative government under Thatcher could defeat major strikes in nationalised industries, particularly targeting the influence of trade unions. Now, the most influential trade union at that time was the 300,000 strong National Union of Mine Workers, who had defeated Heath's Tory government in 1974. And this plan, the Ridley Plan, was primarily about getting revenge. Key elements of the Ridley Plan included strategic selection of industries for confrontation, categorising them by their vulnerability to strike action, especially coal mining. Secondly, stockpiling coal at power stations to withstand a miners' strike. Thirdly, recruiting non-union lorry drivers to drive imported coal from non-union foreign ports. Also installing dual coal oil firing generators at power stations to reduce reliance on domestic coal. Also cutting off financial support to strikers and forcing unions to fund their own operations. And lastly, training and equipping a mobile police force for controlling picketing. In essence, she created a national police force. The plan was widely regarded as a foundational document in the neoliberal transformation of Britain's economy and society, because it was argued if the miners could be defeated, the rest of trade union influence would collapse. So in March 1984, the Thatcher government deliberately provoked the miners by announcing plans to close 20 pits with the loss of 20,000 jobs and the destruction of entire mining towns and villages. Most of these pits were still economic and had decades of coal still in their seams. And it wasn't for environmental reasons. It wasn't that we stopped using coal. The government just increased the importation of coal. Now, once mines are closed, they tend to flood, and there's no way of opening them again. As a consequence of this, about three-quarters of Britain's miners spontaneously walked out, driven by the slogan, "Close a pit, kill a community." But the government were well prepared, with 6 months of coal stockpiled, anti-strike legislation, the right-wing press telling the usual lies, and a national police force ready to resist the strikers. However, millions of people from all walks of life supported the miners. I was secretary of the Thetford Trades Council at the time. We collected food and donations in Thetford Marketplace at weekends. Two of our number got arrested on the pretence of begging, and our collections were confiscated by the police, who told us with grins on their faces that the money was going into the Police Benevolent Fund. Like other rank and file trade unionists across Britain, we went to support miners on their picket lines. We supported the striking miners at Harworth Colliery in Nottinghamshire. And what we saw of the violence and intimidation of pickets by police officers, especially those drafted in from the Met, will stay with me for the rest of my life. But women against pit closures were particularly active, not only on demonstrations, but also in organising soup kitchens and food distribution. The lesbian and gay community in London, who were also under attack from Thatcher, as I said earlier, came out in support of the miners by going to South Wales in a minibus with their collections and becoming good friends with the miners. When the Sun ran a headline that said, "Perverts support the miners," the lesbian and gays that went to South Wales proudly displayed a banner with that slogan on it, "Perverts support the miners." A film was even made about this in 2014. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. A few years ago, I spoke to Mike Jackson, who set up the group Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. I saw him at Burston Strike School. He was standing at the bar, so I went up and had a chat with him. And I asked him what he thought of the film. And he told me that despite some poetic license to make the account more dramatic, the film was pretty accurate, and he liked the film anyway. So Margaret Thatcher, on the other hand, described the miners as the enemy within. This particularly angered many miners, some of whom had fought in the Falklands War. The police response during the miners' strike was marked by large-scale mobilisation, controversial tactics, and significant violence. They stopped people travelling around the country on the pretence of national security. They blocked roads to stop flying pickets getting to picket lines. On one occasion, I was with a group of Kent miners who were stopped by the Special Patrol Group from going through the Dartford Tunnel. When we said we'd find another way, they smashed the windscreens of all our cars and then threatened us with arrest if we insisted on driving unsafe cars on the road. The worst police violence came at the so-called Battle of Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984. Approximately 6,000 police officers from 18 different forces, including the Metropolitan Police and forces from the east of England, were deployed to South Yorkshire to confront around 8,000 striking miners who were attempting to blockade the Orgreave coking plant. Miners and their supporters should have known that something was up because police officers were deployed on roads, including on the motorway, to direct cars to the picket. In other words, the miners were being ambushed. The police orchestrated a highly organised operation that included mounted police charges, riot shields, police dogs, and the first use of short shield snatch squads on the British mainland. These tactics were described by some officers as intended to incapacitate demonstrators and terrify pickets. The confrontation led to 51 police and over 100 miners being injured in total and 95 arrested. Eyewitness accounts and footage shows police charging on horseback and using truncheons to attack unarmed miners, most just wearing t-shirts and trainers, with some miners being dragged and beaten. They chased miners to a nearby village where residents opened their doors for the miners to take refuge. Police officers broke into people's homes to attack miners. Despite claims by police that they were responding to a barrage of missiles, prosecutors later admitted projectiles were thrown after the charges. When it was pointed out that in their reporting, the BBC had deliberately reversed their footage of the events that day to show mounted police charges responding to missiles being thrown, the BBC claimed that it was a mistake. It was no mistake. The event has since been widely criticised as a premeditated and disproportionate use of force, with allegations of a cover-up and suppression of evidence. In 2025, the British government launched a new inquiry into the Orgreave clashes, 40 years after the event, acknowledging the need for truth and justice. It wasn't just the BBC that told lies and misrepresented what went on. The whole of the mainstream media did. I would encourage you to see this. It's on YouTube, and if you haven't got time to write down the link, just put in Jeremy Deller, Battle of Orgreave. It was a reconstruction by the performance artist Jeremy Deller, where miners played the parts of all of those involved, including some of them playing the part of coppers. And it's well worth a watch. But as I say, it wasn't just the BBC that told lies. For example, after the shunt, the Sun showed a picture of miners' leader Arthur Scargill waving to a friend, suggesting he was giving a Nazi salute. And of course, as a socialist, it's the last thing he would do. Print workers refused to carry the picture and headline in later editions of the paper, hence the message on the front page. If you don't know what the word chapel is the name given to, in the print industry, to union branches. So this was a battle against the whole establishment, ones that the miners were unlikely to win despite their strength. It went on for over a year, resulting in 11,291 arrests 8,392 charged, and the eventual closure of many coal mines, with many losing their jobs. It marked a turning point in British industrial relations and union influence. I'm sorry, this is going to go on for quite a bit longer, so not going to be much of a chance for questions unless we go past half past. It caused immense hardship, and many miners just couldn't go on. Some were even boiling nettles to make soup for their families to eat. It was decided by a narrow vote to have an orderly return to work, despite the government's lie that they had no intention of closing all the pits. They then accelerated pit closures. By 2015, Britain's last deep coal mine, Kellingley Colliery, closed, marking the end of deep mining in Britain. But we're still importing coal. The defeat of the miners marked a turning point in British history. It weakened trade union influence, enabled the privatisation of nationalised industries, and left lasting economic and social scars in former mining communities. In 2020, the Scottish Government pardoned all miners who had been convicted during the strike, and they called for a UK-wide public inquiry into police conduct, especially Orgreave. The following year, 6,000 print workers at Rupert Murdoch's News International went on strike after the company moved production from Fleet Street to a new plant in Wapping, East London. It was claimed by the mainstream press that they were all Luddites who launched the strike in opposition to the introduction of modern computerized printing technology, which threatened to render traditional print union jobs obsolete. Murdoch's strategy, that's what they claimed, but we'll come to it in a moment. Murdoch's strategy involved secretly building and equipping the Wapping plant, then summarily dismissing the striking workers, a move legally justified under Thatcher's anti-union legislation. He did that to avoid redundancy payments. He replaced the sacked workers with members of a union called the EETPU, which was a scab right-wing union that had already been expelled from the TUC. Thatcher's anti-union laws restricted pickets to 6 and banned secondary picketing. Thatcher and Murdoch worked hand in glove. Again, the police also worked hand in glove with Murdoch. Like the miners' strike, it became a violent and protracted dispute, marked by mass demonstrations, frequent clashes with police, and over 1,200 arrests. Thatcher's anti-union laws prevented more than 6 pickets at the plant gates, but even this was prevented by the police as they forced pickets away from the plant onto the roads to demonstrate. The police introduced horses at the picket line to drive the pickets even further away from their legal entitlements. Even meetings involving union leaders, MPs, and other prominent supporters who were addressing the pickets were subject to mass attacks from the police with their batons and snatch squads, who were pulling pickets from the demonstrations and arresting them. Even the local residents in Wapping consistently supported the pickets and complained about the outrageous activities of the police. The pickets, when faced with horses, resorted to sitting down in the road because they knew that horses would not come forward when people were sitting down. So what the police did, they turned their horses around and reversed into the pickets to break up the picket lines and make way for Murdoch's lorries. The Wapping plant became known as Fortress Wapping due to its heavy security, including razor wire, barricades, and a large police presence. Despite widespread solidarity actions, including a failed boycott of Murdoch's papers, which were being distributed via the anti-union haulage company TNT, the strike collapsed the following year in 1987. As I said, the Tory media described this dispute as primarily about opposition by Luddites to the introduction of new technologies. Technology was a minor part of the problem. Indeed, the technology that Murdoch was talking about had already been used for some time in the provincial newspaper industry. In reality, the dispute was about trade union derecognition, in other words, union busting. My view has long been that although we did not win the Wapping dispute, the forces that were arranged against us made that impossible for any union to win. Murdoch advised us of the conditions that would apply at Wapping. One, there would be no negotiations with the unions. Two, there would just be a works council. Eventually, as I said, they did a deal with the SCAB EETPU, who agreed to a sweetheart deal. So that's the third thing. No industrial action of any kind would be tolerated. And that was written into the agreement with the union. Now, no union would ever accept that. Fourthly, there would be legally binding agreements. That went totally against union and TUC policy. This was a set of conditions that no union could possibly accept. 5, there would be a massive reduction in the workforce from more than 5,000 employees to a few hundred who would be hand-picked by the management. 6, a substantial reduction in terms and conditions of employment. Ballots in the various unions overwhelmingly rejected these proposals. The following strike action resulted in the dismissal of the entire workforce. However, Murdoch offered a wage increase of £2,000 per annum to journalists to go to Wapping. He told them that if they did not accept the offer, they would be sacked. In the end, only about 20 of the 300 or so journalists didn't accept Murdoch's offer. You know, solidarity is not a word that most journalists recognise. After a year, the print unions accepted an offer that wasn't very attractive to end the dispute. Given that they had the whole panoply of the state, the police, and the mass media against them, this was understandable. The defeat of the print unions was once again widely seen as a key factor for Thatcher's anti-union policies, but also for Rupert Murdoch's media empire, who had been working hand in glove with Thatcher's government. And the trade union movement has never really recovered from these two defeats. As I said, it gave the green light for Thatcher's government to privatise a whole range of nationalised industries and utilities that had been established under the post-war Labour government of Clement Attlee. The key sectors and specific entities privatised during her premiership included on energy and utilities. It was British Gas was privatised in 86, and electricity was split into 12 regional companies and sold off. Later generating companies like National Power and Powergen were also privatised. Water utilities across England and Wales were privatised in the 1980s and 1990s. As far as transport and railways were concerned, British Rail, whilst the full privatisation of the rail network occurred under her successor John Major, the process began under Thatcher. The infrastructure was split and sold off starting in 1994. British Airways was privatised in 1987. British Steel was privatised in 1988. Rolls-Royce was privatised in 1987. British Aerospace was privatised in 1986. In telecommunications and technology, British Telecom was privatised in 84, with employees given the opportunity to buy shares. And other industries and assets such as Amersham International, which was a nuclear research company, was privatised. Half of Cable and Wireless was privatised. Sea-Link Ferries, British Transport Hotels, Travellers Fair Catering, British Railway Engineering Limited were all sold off between 1984 and 1989. Overall, over 40 major state-owned businesses employing 600,000 workers were privatised during Thatcher's time in office, transforming Britain's economic landscape and stifling ownership from public to private and shifting ownership from public to private hands. It was all on the pretense that she was creating a share owning democracy. However, while shares were often initially sold to employees of these industries or members of the general public, they soon became concentrated in the hands of big business. Also, on the question of the private sector being more efficient than the public sector, that ideology has proved to be largely a fallacy. And where savings have been made, it has been at the expense of worse wages and conditions for those working in those industries. I can't think of a single privatisation that has led to a cheaper and better service and or better wages and conditions for its workers. It has, however, led to huge profits for the wealthy and is one of the major reasons why the wealth and income gaps have grown exponentially over the last 40 years. Having said all that, Thatcher's nemesis, though sadly not her legacy, was just around the corner. And this is what I want to finish on. In 1990, Thatcher, thinking that she was invincible, replaced the rates that people paid to local authorities based mainly on the size of the property they lived in. She replaced that with the so-called community charge. Under the old rate system, if you lived in a mansion, you paid much more than if you lived in, say, a council flat. The community charge, however, was based on the number of people who lived in a household. So basically, a family of four living in a council flat would pay four times as much as a wealthy landowner living in his or her own in a mansion. So it was colloquially dubbed the poll tax because registrations to vote from households would be used to determine how many people lived in each household. Consequently, many people didn't register to vote, therefore disenfranchising them and ensuring a Tory majority in any election. But millions refused to pay, especially in Scotland. The All Britain anti-poll tax Federation led the resistance, promoting non-payment and mass demonstrations. It led to a series of widespread protests and violent clashes right across the country. The largest and most significant event occurred on the 31st of March 1990 in Trafalgar Square, where an estimated 200,000 demonstrators had gathered in a peaceful march to oppose the tax. The protest turned violent after police attempts to clear the area, particularly near Whitehall and Downing Street. It led to clashes involving riot police and mounted police charges on demonstrators. 113 people were injured, including 45 police officers. Over 340 people were arrested, with final figures reaching 491. There was extensive property destruction. Despite claims by some officials that the violence was orchestrated by anarchists, a 1991 police report found absolutely no evidence of organised provocation, and later legal efforts by the so-called Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign revealed police misconduct and inflated charges against protesters. The riots intensified opposition to the tax, contributing to Thatcher's resignation in November 1990. Her successor, John Major, announced in 1991 the replacement of the poll tax with the council tax, which we still basically have today. There have been changes to it. So the riots were widely seen as a pivotal moment in British political history, highlighting deep public discontent with economic policies perceived as regressive and unfair. She had taken a step too far in transferring wealth from the poorest to the richest. However, as I said, the legacy of Thatcherism is that whatever government came next, Thatcherite hegemony remained fairly intact for the next 35 years, increasing the gap between the wealthiest and the rest of us year on year since. Sorry, I've gone way over time, but that's it. If anybody's got a burning question before we close, can you please ask it? Thank you. Yeah, Kevin, can you unmute or unmute yourself?
Right, hopefully my mic is working. Yeah, it was only about, apologies for not attending last week. I know I asked the week before, um, are there links, but I'm not sure well, I wasn't able to find it. So are there links to last week's and the first week's?
Yeah, they're on YouTube.
Okay, under your name or
Well, they're under my name, but
okay,
they're also the title is, if you want to write it down, the title is Your Party, um, West Suffolk slash
yeah,
BSE ampersand, or the and sign,
yeah,
and Stowmarket
okay.
politics talks, and then it's one, two, and three after that. The first three are already on there.
Great. Okay, thanks for that, Jack.
You got it, Kevin? Yeah,
Yeah,
good.
thanks. Just and also a quick observation, if I may.
Yeah,
Couple of things. Another program to watch would be Boys from the Black Stuff.
yeah.
Is a very good example of what was going on at the time.
Is that on YouTube now, or
I'm not sure. It probably is somewhere.
yeah, yeah, it might be.
Uh,
Yeah,
so Boys from the Black Stuff, and you'll meet Yozo, and he was an excellent example of some, someone that suffered from the severe effects of mental health and everything like that, from what Thatcher has done to people, had done to
yeah,
people. And also sort of remembering back for myself, um, I came out of school in 79 and the experience of trying to get a job and how you were made to feel was absolutely disgusting.
Yeah,
It was really cruel what that Thatcherism and that ideology did to people.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's
but
important to recognize that and see where that 40 plus years of Thatcherism, neoliberalism has really gone, really.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's still with us. We're not
Yeah,
going to get rid of it overnight.
no,
That kind
no,
of
no.
attitude, and you know, you saying about not being able to get a job. Do you remember what Norman Tebbit said?
Get
The
on your bike.
Yeah, the employment minister. He said my father didn't, when he was unemployed in the 30s, didn't complain. He got on his bike and went looking for work.
Yeah, didn't work that way.
No, it didn't work that way.
What
No,
we
but
ended up doing was getting YTS, JTS, and various
yeah.
employment schemes just to hide the amount of actual unemployment there was.
Absolutely, all those schemes, YOPS, YTS, and all of them,
Mm,
they were just. You're quite right, Kevin. They were just to hide the
mm,
number of unemployed because as soon as people came to the end of their scheme, there was no job for them,
mm,
so they went back on the dole.
mm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
cool.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Is I hope you enjoyed tonight, and I'm sorry you didn't get much of a chance to ask any questions, but hopefully next week you'll get more of a chance. But some of those links on when Claire sends me the recording of it, I'll put it on YouTube, and then you can follow up those links, like to the film Pride and um, the Della um, thing, um, on the miners' strike and so on. You can follow up those links, hopefully. So thanks again for coming. Claire, did you want to say
Um,
anything?
no, I enjoyed that quite a lot because I know a lot of it, but not great, huge amounts because I wasn't well, I was born, but I was a bit young. But yeah, I found it filled in so many of the questions I kind of had, but not for now, obviously. Um, but yeah, I liked what ran up to, Thatcher coming to power, the
Yeah,
politics and the rock against racism and all of that kind of stuff.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
funny. I went to see Elvis Costello recently, or a couple of years ago, at over at what's the place called at Brandon?
Are you
Um,
thinking of the Forest place?
yeah, the Forest Place. And there was about
NCT.
2,000 people there. And I spoke to someone, they said, "Oh, there's not that many people here, is there?" I said, "No, last time I saw Elvis Costello, there was 80,000 people there."
Mm,
And that was the Rock Against Racism. Yeah,
mm. Yeah, it sounds. I mean, whenever you do your talks as well, you always talk about your own experience, and I'm jotting it down. You went to the Kent pickets, you went to the Nottingham pickets.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I'll tell you a funny story from when we went to the Harworth pickets. Every morning, the picket would be there early, and it was during the winter, and they used to build a snowman. And when the police turned up in their big police van, they used to drive straight at the snowman and knock it over. So one morning they did that, and what the miners had done was built the snowman around a bollard. So the police drove their van straight into a bollard.
I love these kinds of strategies and art activism and all these different ideas. It just really, you know,
Yeah.
it,
But there was also a nasty side to that as well, because the police were getting loads of overtime. And the miners were starving. The police were getting loads of overtime. Every night when they pulled away in their van, they'd all be waving £10 notes out of the window at the miners.
That's just diabolical, isn't it?
It is, yeah,
They did so well though, didn't they? The community getting all the food into
yeah,
certain
yeah,
venues and
yeah,
there's the solidarity
yeah.
and that. Did you go anywhere else other than Kent and Nottingham?
Uh, no, we did most of what we did was collecting in Thetford. And I mean that was another thing where the police moved us on because they said we were begging in the marketplace, and the local vicar of that church in Thetford Marketplace said, "Put your stall on my ground." He said, "That's private ground, and they can't move you on from there." So the local vicar was very supportive, and we had we had loads of. I mean, we got some abuse, but we had loads of people coming and giving us donations. And there was one young girl. The supermarket was just round the corner. I can't remember which supermarket it was. One young girl came with a whole trolley full up with food. And she said, "My dad's doing his shopping round the corner and he said to bring this round for you. But he doesn't want any publicity." But it was, it must have cost, a lot of money, a full week shop, more than a full week shopping,
So, sorry, that's my son's bed alarm. Yeah, so I like that they supported the Brunswick um strike as well, the miners, didn't they?
Yes, yeah, yeah. Well, that,
Yeah.
that that was what trade unionism was about. It was about supporting each other. It was about solidarity. We're all working class and we're fighting for the same thing. Um,
I just find it so sad that the only woman prime minister we've had, and she comes in and does so much damage.
well, she's the first of two we've had.
Oh yeah, at
No,
that
no,
time though, I
three,
meant.
three now,
No,
isn't
no,
it?
no, at that time. I mean, the others are
Yeah, at
quite
that time, yeah,
forgettable, to be fair. It was like blink and you missed
yeah,
with one.
yeah, yeah. With the third one, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So, and then all that stuff today about what reform said, it just feels like that again a little bit, doesn't it? That
yeah. It is, yeah, yeah.
that those tactics sort of thing.
So we got to fight back. That's the thing. We got to fight back. I'm not of an age or not in the best of health, as you know, to do. And I'm doing this because this is one of the things I can do. Um,
If people just realized your pedigree and what you've done in your,
yeah, well,
but that's hopefully what the series will be for, for people to go back and use as resources. But
yes,
I will
hopefully, yeah,
stop talking and let everyone get off to
yeah,
enjoy the rest of their May Day.
yes. Thank you, everyone.